Found a hotel receipt in my husband's coat pocket on a Tuesday morning in March, and the name on it wasn't mine. It wasn't some dramatic discovery. I wasn't snooping. I was taking his wool coat to the dry cleaner, the grey one he'd worn to his company dinner the Friday before, and when I reached into the pocket to check for tissues the way I'd been doing for 34 years, my fingers found a folded piece of paper instead, a receipt from the Harbourview Inn over in Westport. 2 nights. A king suite. Check out that Sunday. My husband had told me he was at a regional sales conference in Hartford that weekend. I stood in our kitchen with that piece of paper in my hand, and I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even sit down. I just read it again, slowly, the way you read something when your brain refuses to accept the words the first time. Then I folded it back exactly the way I'd found it, slipped it into my own cardigan pocket, and finished packing the coat into the dry cleaning bag. I am 63 years old. I have been married to my husband for 34 years. We have a daughter who just turned 30, a son-in-law who coaches Little League, and 2 grandchildren who call me Nana Bet. I worked 26 years as a billing supervisor at Mercy General before I retired. I'm not a woman who falls apart in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning. I'm just not. But I will tell you that I stood at the sink for a very long time after that, looking out at the bird feeder my husband had put up last spring, and I thought about every weekend I could remember him being away in the past year. I counted 4. 4 weekends he'd told me were work trips. I thought about the new cologne I'd noticed in September and assumed was a gift from his office secret Santa. I thought about how he'd started going to the gym at 6 in the morning, which I'd been quietly proud of him for, thinking he was finally taking his doctor's advice about his blood pressure. I felt like the stupidest woman alive, and then I decided I was done feeling that way. I did not confront him that night. I know that surprises people. When I've told this story to my sister, she said she would have had his bags on the porch before he got home from work, and maybe that would have been right for her, but I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I opened my mouth. I needed to be certain, and I needed a plan, because I know my husband. He is a man who, when cornered, becomes a man I don't recognize, defensive, cold, a rewriter of history. I wasn't going to give him the chance to spin this before I had all the facts. So I started paying attention. Not in a frantic, obsessive way, in a quiet, methodical way, the way I used to audit insurance claims at the hospital. I started listening more carefully to his phone calls when he took them in the garage. I started noticing when his cell phone was face down on the counter, which it almost always was. Now that I was watching, I noticed that he'd started taking his truck to work instead of the sedan, even though the sedan got better mileage and gas wasn't cheap. I noticed he'd changed the password on his laptop, which he'd never bothered to do in 15 years of having one. I gave it 3 weeks. 3 weeks of watching and being patient and sleeping next to him in our bed and saying good morning and asking about his day like nothing in the world was wrong. 3 weeks of being invisible the way women our age learn to be invisible, and using that invisibility the way it deserved to be used. In the 3rd week, my daughter stopped by on a Wednesday afternoon. She doesn't know any of this yet. I'll get to that. She came by to drop off the kids while she went to a dentist appointment, and after she picked them up, she stayed for coffee the way she sometimes does, and she mentioned, completely casually, that she'd run into her father and that woman from his office at the Millbrook Farmers Market the previous Saturday. My daughter didn't think anything of it. She said they'd waved, and her father had said the woman was a new colleague he was mentoring, and my daughter had believed him because why wouldn't she? I asked her what the woman looked like. Oh, she was younger, my daughter said, maybe 40, pretty, dark hair. She looked at me a little funny when she said it. I smiled and refilled her coffee. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I went to my husband's company website, which is publicly accessible because he works in commercial real estate and the agents all have profile pages. I went through every female agent in the office. There were 11 and I found her on the 4th try. dark hair, 41 according to her bio, licensed in Connecticut and New York, smiled at me from the screen like she didn't know who I was. I wrote her name down on a notepad. Then I put the notepad in my underwear drawer under a stack of slips, which is a place my husband has not looked since 1987. I want to be honest with you about what those weeks felt like, because I think people sometimes tell these stories like the wronged woman is some kind of superhero who doesn't bleed. I bled. I cried in the shower 3 times, long, quiet crying that I made sure was finished before the water turned cold. I had a night in mid-March where I lay awake until 3 in the morning doing maths, how old I would be if I left now, what my social security would look like, whether the house was worth more than the mortgage. I know that sounds cold and calculating, but it isn't. It's what women do when they've been blindsided and they're trying to figure out if they'll survive. And I was going to survive. I was absolutely going to survive. I called my friend Yvonne, who had been through a divorce 12 years ago. I didn't tell her about my situation. I just said I was asking for a friend, and I asked her what she wished she'd known before everything started. She talked for 40 minutes. I took notes. I called a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer, not yet. Just a consultation with a family law attorney over in New Haven that Yvonne had used. A very calm woman who explained to me in plain language what my rights were, what marital assets meant under Connecticut law, what documentation would be helpful to have. I paid her consultation fee out of my personal checking account, the one I'd kept in my own name since before we were married, the one my husband had always considered my pin money account, with a kind of gentle condescension I now wanted to take back and examine very carefully. I went home that afternoon and made pot roast. In early April, my husband told me he had another conference. This one was supposedly in Providence 2 nights, Thursday through Saturday. I said, "That sounds like a nice trip. Will you have any time to see the waterfront?" He said he doubted it. It was a very full schedule. I said I hoped he'd get a chance to relax a little. He said he'd try. I waited until he was in the shower Friday morning, and I took a photograph of the inside cover of his day planner, which he'd left open on the nightstand. Old habit. He'd always preferred paper for certain things. There was no conference listed for Providence. There was nothing listed for that weekend at all. I drove him to the train station at 7:15 because he'd asked me to, said he was taking the train to avoid parking hassle, and I kissed him on the cheek the way I always did, and I told him to have a safe trip. He squeezed my hand. I watched him walk into the station. Then I sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes. Then I drove to my daughter's house. She opened the door in her bathrobe and stared at me. It was 7:45 in the morning. I had not called ahead. I said, "I need to talk to you, and I need you to stay calm, and then I need your help with something." She put on coffee. I told her everything. I want to say that I had imagined this conversation many times over those weeks, and in my imagination, my daughter always cried immediately or got very angry or started asking 100 questions at once. What she actually did was sit very still for a long moment, with her hands around her mug, and then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her, 3 weeks. She said, "And you've been cooking dinner every night for 3 weeks?" I said, "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" That is my daughter. That is who she is. I don't know where she came from, certainly not from the woman who spent 3 weeks crying in the shower, but she is steadier than I have ever been, and I am grateful for her every single day. What I needed from her was a favor that I was not proud to ask. I needed her to drive to the Harborview Inn in Westport, the same one from the receipt, and confirm whether her father's truck was in the parking lot. I wasn't going to go myself. I looked too much like his wife. My daughter looked like her father. She put down her coffee cup and she said, "Give me 20 minutes to get dressed." She found the truck on the first pass through the lot, silver F-150, his license plate. She texted me a photo without my even asking. Then she drove home. I sat in her kitchen for a long time after she left. I drank 2 cups of coffee. I watched her cat sleep on top of the refrigerator. I thought about the morning my husband and I had moved into our house. The boxes everywhere, the way he'd carried me over the threshold as a joke because we'd forgotten to do it after the wedding, how we'd both laughed until we were out of breath. I let myself feel that for a few minutes. I think you have to let yourself feel it, or it turns into something harder and colder than it needs to be. Then I picked up my phone. I had not planned this next part, or maybe I had, somewhere in the back of my mind, without admitting it to myself. But I opened the web browser on my phone, and I looked up the Harbour View Inn, and I called the front desk. A young man answered. I said, "Good morning. I'm trying to reach my husband. He's a guest, and he's not picking up his cell. His name is," and I gave the name, our last name. "He may have checked in with a colleague. Could you ring the room?" There was a pause, the sound of typing. He said, "I'm showing a reservation under that name, ma'am. Let me connect you." I hung up. I didn't need to hear the phone ring in that room. I already knew everything. But now I also knew exactly which room he was in, or close enough, and that the reservation was in his name, which meant he'd used a credit card I had access to. I thanked God, not for the first time, that I had spent 26 years in billing. I went home. I made myself a sandwich. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened the joint credit card of my laptop. I had every right to, it was my account too. And I looked at the charges from the past 6 months. And there it was. Harbour View Inn, twice. A restaurant in Westport called the Thai Table, 3 times. A jewelry store in New Haven in February, 2 days before Valentine's Day. He had given me a card for Valentine's Day, a Hallmark card with a poem about enduring love. I had put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a lobster we'd bought in Maine in 2019. I took the card off the refrigerator. I put it in the trash. Then I went to my desk and I started making copies of everything. This is the part people always want to skip over, but it's actually the most important part. The paperwork, the documentation. I printed 6 months of credit card statements. I printed our joint checking account history. I made a list, handwritten because my handwriting is harder to dispute, of every weekend he'd been away in the past year and what he'd told me each time. I got the dry cleaning receipt. I had never actually taken the coat. It was still hanging in my closet, and I put it in a folder. I downloaded the photograph my daughter had sent me of the parking lot. I called the family law attorney again. I made an appointment for the following Wednesday. I told my husband I had a dental cleaning. He came home Saturday evening in a good mood, which is almost funny in retrospect. He asked what I wanted to do for dinner. I said I was thinking of making pasta. He said that sounded great. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen island the way he always did when I was cooking, and he told me about a property deal that was moving forward, and I stirred the sauce and I listened and I said the right things, and I thought, 3 more days. I chose Monday. I chose Monday because it was ordinary. A Tuesday would have felt theatrical. A Friday would have ruined the weekend in a way that felt like a cliché. Monday morning, the kids are in school. My daughter knew what was happening. The lawyer's office was open. It was a work day in every sense. He was eating toast when I came into the kitchen. He was already dressed for the office, jacket on, keys on the counter. He looked up and said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." I put the folder on the kitchen island in front of him. I said, "I'd like you to look at that." He looked at the folder. He looked at me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "Please open it." He opened it. I watched his face while he looked at the credit card statements, the receipt, the parking lot photo. I watched the color change in his neck, the way it does when his blood pressure rises. He goes red from the collar up, has done it for 30 years. He went through the papers slowly, which surprised me. I had expected him to close the folder. When he finished, he set it down on the island and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you had this?" And I said, "Long enough." He started to say something about how things had been difficult between us, which is what they say, isn't it? They always reach for that first, the difficulty, as though difficulty is an explanation instead of an experience that both people have been living through. I let him say it. I didn't interrupt. And when he finished, I said very calmly, "I've spoken with a lawyer. I know what I'm entitled to under Connecticut law. I'm not interested in a conversation about difficulty right now. I'm interested in what happens next, and I'd like you to think about whether you want to handle this reasonably or whether you want to make it very hard for both of us." He stared at me. I think he had expected me to cry. I think on some level he had been waiting for that for weeks. The crying, the pleading, the "how could you?" I think he'd been braced for that kind of storm, and it wasn't coming, and he didn't know what to do with that. I said, "I'd like you to move your things to the guest room for now while we figure this out, and I'd like you to cancel whatever you have planned this coming weekend." He said my name, just my name, like a question. I said, "I mean it." He moved to the guest room. I won't tell you the next several months were easy. They weren't. There were nights that were very dark and conversations that were bruising and moments where I wavered, not about leaving, because I was clear on that, but about whether I was strong enough to do it the right way instead of the destructive way. There is a destructive way, and it's tempting. You want to blow things up. You want everyone to know. You want his colleagues to know and the neighbors to know and the woman with the dark hair to know exactly who she's been spending those long weekends with. I didn't do it that way. I'm not going to claim I was noble. I was strategic. There's a difference, but the outcome is the same. My lawyer was worth every penny. She walked me through the process the way a good nurse walks you through a procedure. Here's what will happen. Here's what to expect. Here's what to watch for. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, which doesn't mean equal, but does mean fair. And fair, when you have documentation and 34 years of marriage and a spouse who wants to avoid a scene, tends to look reasonably good for the person who did the work. I got the house. That's the part my daughter cried about, actually. Not anything else but the house. She grew up in that house. Her children know every corner of it. When the paperwork came through and my lawyer called to tell me, I was standing in the kitchen by the window with the bird feeder, the same window I'd been standing at in March when I first found the receipt. And I sat down on the floor, not dramatically, just suddenly, and I put my face in my hands and I cried in a way I had not let myself cry in 6 months. A clean crying. The kind that comes when something is finally, truly finished. I also negotiated a settlement that took into account the years I'd put into our household and his career, the moves we'd made for his promotions, the years I'd worked part-time when our daughter was young, the unpaid labor that doesn't show up anywhere on paper, but that Connecticut law allows you to make an argument for. My lawyer made the argument. He settled rather than litigate. That's the practical part. Here's the personal part. I called Yvonne and told her everything, finally. She came over with a bottle of Prosecco, and we sat on my back porch and watched the birds, and she didn't say "I told you so," which I will love her for until the day I die. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, which I'd been thinking about doing for 11 years. I went to the first class and I was terrible. I went to the third class and I was slightly less terrible. I go every Thursday now, and I love it in a way that is embarrassingly uncomplicated. My grandchildren spent a week with me in July and we built a birdhouse for the backyard and painted it yellow, which is my granddaughter's favorite color. My grandson informed me it was not a realistic color for a birdhouse. My granddaughter informed him that the birds would like it. I sided with my granddaughter. My daughter asks me sometimes how I'm doing. I tell her the truth, which is, some days are harder than others, and some days are fine, and occasionally a day's actually good in a way that surprises me. She always nods at that, and I can tell she's filing it away, learning something from it that I hope she never needs. The woman with the dark hair. I heard through someone at my husband's office, a man who had worked with us both for years and seemed to feel I deserved to know, left the company in June. I don't know where she went, and I don't particularly care. She isn't really the point. She was never really the point. My husband is renting a condo in Stamford. I don't know if he's still seeing her. I don't ask, and the people in my life have the good sense not to tell me. What I know is this. I found a receipt in a coat pocket on a Tuesday morning in March, and I didn't fall apart. I paid attention. I made a plan. I got a lawyer. And I kept my voice quiet, and I cooked dinner every night for 3 weeks because I am a woman who does not waste the advantage of being underestimated. I am 63 years old, and I live alone in my house for the first time in my life. And the bird feeder outside my kitchen window is full. And most mornings when I look out at it, I feel something I can only describe as mine. That's enough. That's more than enough. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the morning I found the receipt, not the day my husband moved his things to the guest room, but the morning I sat in my daughter's kitchen, watching her cat sleep, on top of the refrigerator, waiting for her to drive back from a hotel parking lot with a photograph I already knew would break something open in me permanently. I remember thinking, how did I get here? And then more quietly, how do I make sure I get out of here whole? I don't think what happened to me was random. I don't mean that in a mystical way. I just mean that the way things unfolded had a logic to it, a cause and effect that ran in both directions. My husband made choices over and over, and those choices created a reality he thought he could manage. What he didn't account for was that I would stop being someone who looked away. The moment I stopped looking away, everything shifted. Not because the universe rewarded me, but because clear seeing leads to clear action, and clear action leads somewhere. It always does. What I learned about myself through all of it was really 3 things, and I didn't know any of them as well as I thought I did before that March morning. The first was about integrity, not the word you put on a greeting card, but the real thing, the private thing, the way you behave when no one is watching and nothing is forcing you to be decent. I could have blown everything up. I wanted to some nights. But I kept asking myself what kind of woman I wanted to be on the other side of this, and the answer kept being a woman who did it right. Not for him, not for appearances, for myself, because I have to live with myself, and I have learned at 63 that self-respect is not something you can borrow back once you've spent it. The second thing was about using your mind, really using it, not just reacting. Those 3 weeks of watching and documenting and consulting a lawyer before I said a single word to my husband were the most important 3 weeks of the whole ordeal. Anger is information. But anger without a plan is just noise. I had spent 26 years in billing, auditing claims, finding the discrepancy in the column of numbers that everyone else had signed off on. I used every bit of that training. The skills I had built in what some people might consider an unremarkable career turned out to be exactly the skills that protected me when it mattered most. And the third thing, the one that surprised me most, was about endurance, not toughness. I don't think I'm particularly tough, but I kept going. I cried in the shower and then I turned off the water and I went back downstairs. I had dark nights and then I had mornings. I made pot roast and I made appointments and I made a folder and I kept putting one foot in front of the other even when I genuinely did not know how the ground would feel when it landed. That persistence, quiet, undramatic, stubbornly forward-moving, turned out to matter more than anything else I brought to those months. My daughter asked me once, toward the end of everything, if I was okay. I said mostly. She nodded and didn't push, which is one of the many things I love about her. I am 63 years old, and I live in my house, and I go to watercolor class on Thursdays, and the bird feeder outside my kitchen window is full. I didn't get here by accident. I got here because, when the moment came, I chose to be the kind of woman who paid attention, made a plan, and didn't stop. That's the whole story, and it's enough.